We want to be in control. It is such a common fact that psychology has researched this desire that we have for control and has created terms like autonomy and self-determination, or an internal locus of control. Basically, we need to believe that our life events are within our personal control. It is even believed that this ability to control our circumstances is part of our psychological well-being. In one study, people decided to make the choice for, more choices. Welcome to the He So I Project, the podcast that is for people who want to know God and discover who we were created to be. In this episode, we will be discussing an attribute of God that seems to be in conflict with our desire for control. I am your host, Dr. Eric Moyer, an author, a researcher, and a podcaster. And my co-host is Eric Miller, pastor of Grace Community Church in Loveland, Colorado. So, Eric, this seems to be one of those attributes of God that constantly gets pushed back on. All right. And I know this is going to be one of those episodes that we're going to get to the end and we'll have only just begun the conversation. So,
yes. Well, to cover sovereignty in any meaningful way in a brief amount of time is just naturally, there are tons of limitations. I think what you're talking about with sovereignty being something that is pushed back on so frequently, I think it's pushed back on in some ways because people don't understand it. And I think it's pushed back in other ways because people do understand it. And so in both of those ways, I think just getting maybe at least a grasp of biblically what sovereignty looks like, even if it's at a 50,000 foot level, is amazingly beneficial because this is one of God's core attributes, one of his incommunicable attributes.
Mm-hmm. So I started off with this idea that we like to have choices. We like to control. I mean, if you go into a burger joint and they only have two types of burgers, we're wondering what is wrong with the place because we're not having enough choices in the types of burgers or toppings that we have. So I kind of take that, and I always think of that as the antithesis of God's sovereignty. Is our control and God's sovereignty kind of go head to head. So what is your thinking? It's like you said that people don't understand, fight against sovereignty because they don't understand it, but then people fight against it because they do understand it. What is your thought about why do people fight against sovereignty? I'd love to get your thoughts.
Well, I think in two ridiculously big buckets. So this is obviously there's a ton of nuance that could go along with it. I think first and foremost, people fight against the concept of God's sovereignty with a false understanding. And that's the idea that, well, if God is sovereign, that he's a puppet master and that I have no free will of my own, that I'm not actually making my decisions, but they're being made for me. That, of course, is not accurate. To an extent, we have moral agency. To an extent, especially as a believer, we have a ton of agency. Even those who do not have the Lord in their lives yet have agency differently, of course. And then I think the other side of things is people push back on sovereignty because sometimes we want to do what we want to do. And we don't want to think that God is in control of as much as he is, which is, again, it's a fundamental misunderstanding because knowing the gracious, loving character of God, the way that Spurgeon put it is that God's sovereignty is the pillow that the Christian rests his head upon. It is meant to not only be true because it's been communicated biblically, but it's meant to be one of those things that we take great comfort in, that the one who is in control of all things is working for our good and his glory in all things.
Yeah. I think that you're right in both cases. Is But I think that I'm going to add another piece to that, another dimension of that is whenever you actually, and I'm coming at it from both a biblical and a psychological standpoint. Whenever you look at some of the research that is out there around our desire for control, I don't know if anyone else is a control freak, okay, and likes to be in control. That is one of the things that I do struggle with. Because I do like to be in control. And in most areas of my life, I do have agency, which is nice. But in the research about people who are they like control, one of the interesting aspects of it is that people many times want control, not out of power, but out of fear. If you've ever heard of that, okay. Is that they want control because they are afraid that if they're not in control, then things are going to go badly for them. Or that someone else is going to be in control and that those other individuals in control are going to not do things that are good for them. And so really many times what they find is that this desire for control is really coming from a sense of fear or insecurity, which I find really interesting whenever you talk about your second aspect of God, is that it comes from a misunderstanding of who God is.
Yeah, I mean, my thought right away is, if we know who God is, even to, I mean, obviously, the person who's studied God his or her entire life still only has a thimbleful of the ocean.
Right.
But at the same time, we can know God personally, and we can know attributes of him deeply. If you even have just a small drop of what God has revealed of himself, just in the statement alone that God is good, then if God is good, I'm really excited that he's in control of more than I am, because I try the best I can to make decisions that I believe are what would honor God the most and would come from my redeemed identity, but I fail at that. Right. So knowing that there is a God of the universe that is actually working, and again, I don't mean to return to Romans 8:28 often, but when we're talking about sovereignty, for me, that verse it was quickly memorized when I first came to Christ, because I need to be reminded when things seem crazy that God is working all things, not just some things, but all things. Yeah.
Yeah, that's going to be, I think we're probably going to come back to that verse quite a bit during this discussion. But let's just take a step back and let's start off with really getting a grasp for people, because we're using this word sovereignty and sovereign, which is not a word that is used frequently in everyday language. But let's just take a step back and answer the question, what does it mean for God to be sovereign? So let's just, we can each kind of share our own perspective on this, but I'd love to hear your starting point.
Sure. I love the term. Sovereignty relates to someone being sovereign or ruler or king, as we would understand it in the English. I think that it comes from God's core attributes of omnipotence, omniscience, and omnipresence. So if we just take the three omnis, which is what we so often start with when getting to understand God as best we can, if God is limitless in power, if he's limitless in knowledge, and he is everywhere at once in his fullness throughout time and eternity, it would mean that God has access to everything at once, and is his sovereignty, his rulership, his organization, his providence comes out of just who he is as creator and sustainer of the universe. So it's used in the term where we see Lord. And Lord in the Old Testament can mean several different of God's names. It can mean Yahweh. It can mean different names that are all underneath that term Lord or God. But I think in the New Testament, when Jesus speaks of why do you say Lord, Lord, and not do as I say? I love that statement because, even Peter's statement when he tries to rebuke Jesus and he says, "No, Lord," it should be just immediately like, those words don't go together.
Yeah.
So without getting too much into it, I think it speaks of God's power and God's planning throughout time and eternity in the working of what we understand as human existence.
Okay. I always go back to sovereign with the idea of, I think where you went with Lord, of king, of ruler, because we don't use that terminology in America. But there are still places in the world where there is a king, where there is what they actually call a sovereign. And that's where the terminology comes from, is this idea of kingship, of lordship, of authority, if you want to think about it that way. And we don't really have a good sense of that in our culture, because we have created this culture in the United States and in America of individualism and individual power and individual autonomy and authority. And I'm allowed to have my voice and I'm allowed to have my say, and I should be able to do what I want to do and go where I want to do and even be who I want to be. And there is no one to tell me otherwise. And we so value and uplift that ideal of individual rights. And I love that term, rights. We have a right to our own individual autonomy. But what we're saying is that God is the King of all kings, the Lord of all lords. He is over everything. He is the creator of everything. He is the sustainer of everything. He has not just the right, but the ability and the responsibility to be over everything and to rule everything. We don't get that. We haven't lived in that realm where we lived in a kingdom where there was a king, where everything was the king's. Even back in medieval times, and I think even back in biblical times, they understood this more than we understand this. Because when there was a king, everything was the king's. Even their own land that they farmed and that their house was actually supposedly the king's, and they were just using it at the pleasure of the king. And even supposedly their own lives were the king, and the king could do whatever he wanted at any point with them. So he could call up people and call them to be part of his army and send them off to war. And they had there was no volunteer. It was, you were told by the king.
Yeah.
And you had no rights.
I love the point that you're making, because I think to a certain extent, to where we have seen human kings and queens and people in authority abuse their power, not for the good of people, but for the good of themselves. If we view it through the lens of human experience, then we superimpose this negativity related to God's kingship, his sovereignty. And we'd say, well, if all these humans do terrible things with their power and authority, then why would I want to be comfortable with a sovereign God? If he is the King of all kings, and I've seen really, even in the best kings, deficiencies, then why would I want to grant God sovereignty? So, of course, even just for a statement, we don't grant God sovereignty. He is sovereign. Yeah, I figured you were, so I wanted to make sure I say that. God is king whether we make him king or not. He is not waiting for our vote. He is not. It's not elect Jesus for king. He is king. We acknowledge his kingship to our benefit. It's not as if we make him king. When people say, "Oh, yeah, I made Jesus the Lord of my life," I'm like, Jesus has always been the Lord of your life. You have chosen to yield your life to him, to your benefit and to his glory. But
Right.
yeah, I think negative experience sometimes takes away from the awesome truth of God's sovereignty.
Yeah. I mean, just think about the phrase that everyone knows. Power corrupts, and absolute power
Corrupts absolutely.
there you go. That is our understanding of power. It is that if you allow people power, you give them authority. You give them you give them the ability to rule. The more power you give them, the more corrupt they are going to become. That's kind of our assumption. And I like what you said is that we just then superimpose that same exact idea on God. And we say, if God is all powerful, then there must be something wrong and we can't trust it.
Well, and we can even go deeper into that because then and I don't know if you want to go here, but this is where it gets sticky, is if God is all powerful, why is the world the way it is currently?
So there's an interesting question, because and we've been struggling with that over the past number of weeks, and most people may not know when this is being recorded, but this is being recorded in July, a couple of weeks after the tragic floods in Texas. And that is actually one of the questions that we have had to struggle with friends and individuals is, if God is sovereign, how could he allow this to happen? And it is always an interesting discussion to recognize both the tragedy and the hurt that people are going through, but also try to remind them that God still is sovereign and that he is still good, and that tragedies happen. People get sick. People get hurt. There is crimes that occur that are horrendous in people's lives. And God is still sovereign, and God is still good, even though those bad things still happen. And I heard one pastor say this, and I thought it was so well said, is we may not understand completely on this side of heaven how all things work for the good of those who love him, even though some of those things that God has allowed can be very difficult.
I think this is where, well, so much to say there. C.S. Lewis has a great book on suffering. And I think in addition to that, there have been other books on suffering, which I've read, that they start first and foremost with addressing the heart and the emotion. And I think that sometimes we jump quickly to theology, which I'm not saying is removed from the experience. Theology is very important. Right understanding of God is a good thing. So much of what is needed in moments of great tragedy is support and presence. And we see that, we see that time and time biblically is people are not looking for, they're not looking for the answer, the right answer per se. They're looking to be comforted. And so the greatest prayer there is, God, it's not help me understand exactly why this happened, but help me experience your presence in my pain.
I like designing T-shirts for different things, and I'm working on T-shirts to go along with these different attributes of God, and I'm working on it. But whenever this happened, I actually got this idea for a T-shirt, that I'm actually planning on seeing if I can get it out there, is that where it says, God is my help, so I can be his help to others.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's part of what you're saying there, is that we don't always we're not always supposed to realize or recognize why God does what he does. And we're not needed to come in and be the person that says, here, let me tell you why God is doing this.
Mm-hmm.
But we can be God's presence in that circumstance, and just being there and praying with someone, or just hugging them or helping them, just being some hands and feet in that circumstance to help them just get through the circumstance that they are in. It doesn't diminish the circumstance, and it doesn't try to answer the question that we may not have the answer to, but we can be God's hands and feet in that circumstance.
Yeah, and I think that, you read the beginning of 2 Corinthians, and Paul states that we're comforted with the comfort that we ourselves have received. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so much, and this is one thing, not in the heart of the pain, because again, what we're talking about is that when someone's in the heart of the pain, and the depth of the situation, then theological answers and working out scripture, that probably is not exactly the best time for that. But afterwards, and I think I've seen it in my life, I know I've seen it in my life, and maybe you've seen it in yours as well, is that I know that I've gone through certain things so that I can talk with other people who are going through it, and we can relate to one another. Mm-hmm. There's been experience where someone said, "Oh, you've gone through that too," and it just means more, I think, when you can say, "Yeah, I've been through a very similar situation, and this is how God has brought me through it." I think that's one of the reasons at times, why we go through the hardship that we do. Now, it's hard because I don't want to make the whole conversation about God's sovereignty about difficulty.
Right.
Yeah. And I think it's important to address it in terms of, just to back up to where you were going, is, why do people balk at the concept of God's sovereignty? And I think sometimes it's because, we've experienced hardship. And if God is sovereign, how do we reconcile his goodness with the difficulty that we are presented with on a regular basis?
Mm-hmm. And I think that your answer is a good one. And I think you gave it, maybe not in the way that I'm going to say it, but it's that you have to marry that attribute of sovereignty with the other attributes of who God is. You can't take, this goes back to whenever we talked about God as the I am. He is who he is, complete, all of it. Mm-hmm. He is consistently who he is in its totality, in every way balanced along the way. So God is sovereign, right? But that sovereignty is not disentangled with his goodness. It is completely in unity with his goodness. So this is where there is an element of faith that we sometimes have to walk down whenever we see things that are going not as we may have expected them. And I think that sometimes, many times, we question God's sovereignty, or we question God's goodness because of our own expectations. We expect things to happen in a specific way, in a sense that we are putting ourselves in the place, well, if I was God, then...
Well, you're nailing it. If God is sovereign and not good, we should live in fear. If God is good but not sovereign, then his goodness doesn't mean as much, because he can't actually act in a powerful way on that good character. Right. So the fact that he is both allows us, I think, a great deal of comfort. What you're saying, though, is and I think really, really appropriately so, is we have to be willing to be honest that God sometimes doesn't do what I want him to do.
Or what I would expect him to do. Yeah.
Or what I would expect him to do. And in those moments, do I have the faith based on what I know to be true of God to say, I don't understand, but I choose to trust? And that's where that faith part, that trust part is so hard. It is also, in my experience, it's also like a muscle, that our trust muscle is trained by saying, God, I know this is true of you, but I'm not experiencing this right now. And yet I choose to believe what you have said and not my experience above what you have said.
Thank you for joining us for part 1 of our discussion about God's sovereignty. We know that there is a lot of questions and even some conflicts with this attribute of God. The He So I Project exists to help people know God so they can discover who He created them to be. If you have questions or comments, please share them with us. We would appreciate the opportunity to respond to them either as part of the regular podcast or personally. You can add comments or contact us through our website at redeemingidentity.com. While at the website, you can sign up to get our newsletter. This newsletter will let you know what we are doing at Redeeming Identity to support your journey of identity transformation, including the publication of our first book, Redeeming Identity, which is scheduled to be released later this year. We look forward to continuing this conversation about God's sovereignty in part 2, which will be released in 2 weeks. Thank you for joining us on the He So I Project, produced by Redeeming Identity, as we discover the identity of God so we can know ourselves.